Hi, this is Pastor Kevin on law enforcement. We are in a time where it seems like there's less and less respect for law enforcement in Western culture. We see it in the United States. We see it somewhat here in Canada as well, where society is not treating our law enforcement with respect. And is it justifiable? In my opinion, it is not justifiable. And there's several reasons for that. One, the law enforcement is there in order to enforce the laws. Yes, the law enforcers officers need to understand their role and their responsibilities, and sometimes things do go awry. Sometimes in overstepping their bounds. Sometimes, but we need to be very careful with this still, though. There's 6 points I want to share with you, my opinion on law enforcement, based on a Christian perspective, biblical view. First is that law enforcement endanger themselves for the good of the people. Law enforcers have a very dangerous job. They never know when they step out that door from their home, whether they have a family or not, they never know whether they're going to come back home that day or not. Because we're in a time, again, where there's no respect for law enforcement. And frankly, there's some people who do some pretty evil stuff out there. And so they never know if they're going to come home safe or not. So they endanger their lives for the people, for your safety and for my safety. So that's something for us to consider. Second is they have to make split-second decisions that could be a matter of life and death for both themselves and those they're dealing with. Again, it is a very dangerous job. If a law enforcer pulls someone over at the side of the road for whatever reason, they never know if the person's going to pull out a gun on them. And yes, it's less likely to happen in Canada than it is in the States, but nonetheless, it still is a possibility and does happen. I remember several years ago, a couple of our CMP officers had gone to Merithorpe to deal with a person who was a known criminal and who was causing problems. And so they went in there, and both of those officers lost their lives. I think there was actually more than two officers lost their lives that day because of this gentleman. I use the term gentleman there loosely in that case because he obviously was not gentle to these officers. So officers have to make these split-second decisions on what to do. And I don't think there's an officer out there who is really that quick to want to be gun crazy. Certainly, some could be a bit slower to pulling out the gun, but you just, again, it's a split-second decision, and we can't necessarily determine that yes, they should or shouldn't in that situation. Again, split-second decision. They're just doing what is they think at that moment, and that split second is the best decision in that moment. Do they maybe later consider maybe that they could have done something better? Well, possibly. I'm sure that most of us think through some situations that we've done that we were part of that we could have thought later that I could have handled that better and I could have handled it this way instead. And so then we learn for the next time. But yes, those officers are doing split-second decisions. So we need to give them some slack with that too. In that regards too, I mentioned in one of the podcasts recently when we talked about Black Lives Matter, about the officers who shot down one person they're looking for. I can't remember the guy's name right now, but it was a split-second decision. The guy was going for a knife in his vehicle, and so they had to make a split-second decision. And again, in that moment there, because they had already tased the guy earlier, and he just kept on going still. And so they had to take several shots at the guy to stop him. So we need to give the officers some slack when it comes to that. We don't know what's happening in the situation. Sometimes when we see video clips in the media, it's but a short clip of what's taking place over a period of time. And so we need to be very considerate of our law enforcement officers when it comes to that. Next, they are not a racist organization. The police forces are not racist organizations. Now, we do know that there are some officers that are racist, and we see that around the world, really, when it comes to law enforcement, that there are some, but as an organization in Canada or in the States, they're not a racist organization. So we need to get that into our heads. Our law enforcement officers, the policies they have are not racist. Individuals of them, quite possibly, as we have seen some actions of some, but just don't assume because an officer pulls a gun on someone of a different race than themselves that they're racist. Frankly, they probably aren't racist. So we need to be very, very careful with that. Treat the officer with respect. You don't know at all what they think about another race until you've actually talked to them and heard their perspective. So don't base it just on pure actions when they're doing their job. So be very careful. Give them the respect they need, again, in that regards. You wouldn't want someone to look at you and say, oh, you must be this way or that way because of the way you look. Like the saying goes, you can't judge a book by its cover. So don't judge our law officers because of one or two actions. If you want to really find out what they believe about a certain race or not, whether they're racist or not, or even are they anti-religion or not, or whatever, ask them the question. Obviously not in the heat of a situation. Maybe that'd be a conversation for another time. But give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume right away that they're racist. Because as an organization, law enforcement is not racist. We see that in the law, in our Constitution, that everyone is equal under the law. So why shouldn't we give them that same consideration? Next thing I want to point out to you is that most officers are outstanding citizens. They are citizens of our country who are serving our country for our betterment, to take care of when people have done wrong, to make sure they are put into the process of facing the full blunt of the law when they're guilty, but also trying to help with bad situations, domestic abuse situations. That's a pretty tough situation for officers to come into, to try to separate a husband beating his wife, or some other kind of abuse happening in the home. Officers have such a hard, bad situations they go into. So most of them are outstanding citizens. Most of my interactions with law enforcement has been very, very, very positive. Yeah, there's the odd officer I've come across that has a little bit of an ego a bit. But most of them I've come across have been outstanding citizens. There's a couple law enforcement officers in our area that I've met and gotten to know a little bit over the years, and they are outstanding citizens. They really do care about our communities. And so, just like you care about your community, they care for the community as well too. I remember in high school too, we had an officer who was the officer for our school, and he'd walk around the hallways and interacting with all the students, and you can just see the care he had for the students. And so give our officers again some slack. They are outstanding citizens doing a very difficult job to try to make our society a better place for each person. Next, it is not your job to hold law enforcement officers to account. This is one that we have to make sure we follow through with, because it's not our job or responsibility in the heat of a situation to be holding them account for their job. That's why they have internal affairs. That's why you can make a complaint about an officer if they have overstepped their bounds. But in the heat of the moment, follow the direction. Because of all the other bad situations these officers face, comply with them and then deal with the issue later. Because it could be a matter of your life or their life as well. So it's not your job to judge them in the moment. There's some situation we have that it's okay. I know there's a term that's used called carding. So if an officer comes up to you, I know this to be the case in Canada with Canadian law, that an officer, if you're walking on the street, comes up to you and asks for your identification, they can ask that, but you can refuse it. Now, if things escalate, follow through and make the complaints later. With biking, if you're on a bicycle and they do carding with you, you're not required to give identification, but you're required by a law to give your address. Then if you're driving the vehicle and an officer stops you, you are required by law to show your driver's license, your identification that way. That's the law. And so if you are stopped by an officer with a vehicle, don't give them a whole big spiel of, oh, you can't ask me for that. They can, and it's the law that you must produce it. So again, when it comes to our law enforcement, it's not your job to hold them accountable. It's internal affairs and the courts to hold them accountable. Yes, you can lodge your complaint after the fact of what happened, but in the heat of the moment, it is better to follow through with what they say. Because again, they don't know how you're going to react and what you're going to do. So for your own safety and for their safety, abide by what they're saying and then deal with it later in the court system. Lastly, as Christians, we need to pray for law enforcement because, again, it is a dangerous job. We should be praying for them, for their safety and for their eternity. May we as Christians be an example to law enforcement officers, whether they be Christians or not, of how we as Christians are to act and show respect and honor to them. Yes, again, there are some law enforcement officers who are bad apples, and that's not good. But even those bad apples need to be prayed for. So may we pray for our law enforcement officers because they put their life on the lines day in, day out for us. And they may not be the governing authorities, but they have given them specific duties and abilities and authorities by the government in order to keep law and the order of law in our society. So may we treat our law enforcement officers with the respect that God tells us to give to them. So the next time you talk to an officer, take the time to stop and say, hey, officer, thank you so much for the hard work you put into to take care of us, to uphold the law, and to keep us safe. Here's a question I'd like to interact with you in the comments down below. The question is this: how can we show respect for our law enforcement officers? Here's that question again. How can we show respect for our law enforcement officers? I look forward to your comments down below, and I'd love to interact with you with your comments. And how can we show respect and honor to our law enforcement officers? I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the subscribe button and hitting the notification bell so you make sure you get notice for every time a video is uploaded to our YouTube channel, and or by signing up to our newsletter on our website at steppingoutministries.com. And through our newsletter, you'll get updates too as when each video is uploaded, as well as what is going on with Stepping Out Ministries. Next time on Pastor Kevin On, I'll be sharing my opinion on the media.